Hello, hello, and welcome to the conversation room. My name is Ellen Wagner. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently tuning in from beautiful Princeton in New Jersey at the US American East Coast. At our check in, we all figured out it is quite hot, and hopefully, this conversation today is also getting some hot and spicy. We are here to talk about not doing harm, and we like to talk about the ethics of DEIB. And if you feel like, what is DEIB? We are going to explain all these abbreviations in just a second. But if this is the very first time that you're tuning in to the conversation room, I'd like to just set the frame and let you know what this is all about. So, the conversation room is a panel format that I established a couple of years ago, where I had in mind that there are a couple of topics, a couple of people that are not represented in social media or just in general out there. So I initiated this format, and we've been talking about being Black and being an entrepreneur, being a DEIB practitioner, all these topics around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, neurodiversity, and other topics. And today we're going to talk about, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, hopefully more in depth. And this is a conversation that does not only include the panelists who are here. I have two wonderful guests with me today, but you can also participate. And the way you can do that is to comment in the chat. So if you're tuning in from LinkedIn, you can use the chat there, the comment section, or you can use the comment section on YouTube if you're tuning in from YouTube. There's also going to be recording on YouTube. So if you missed this conversation, be sure to check out the link that we're going to share after this conversation in social media. So if you just heard that, just test the comment section. Let us know from where you're tuning in. And if you have any kind of question, we try to get back to your questions during our conversation. So I am not here by myself, but I got Annelie Wambeek and I got Sharon Hurley Hall. And if you have not seen me or you're not able to see me right now, I just like to give a visual description. So I'm Ellen, and I'm a light-skinned Black woman with short afro hair. I'm wearing white blouse, and behind me you would see a virtual background. So Annelie, you're next to me. Would you like to introduce yourself, also give a visual description of yourself, and let us know what your main focus at work is?
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be here, and nice to see everyone in the comments as well. My name is Annelie Wambeek, and I'm a trainer, speaker, and facilitator around the topics of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And we'll go into a little bit more what that means later on. And for a quick visual description, I am a brown woman of color, and currently I am sitting in my house in Amsterdam, and the sun is out for once, so the sun is largely obscuring my face, but I am enjoying that. And looking forward to where we're going with this conversation today.
Thank you, Annelie. Sharon, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. Nice to see so many friends in the chat. I am Sharon Hurley Hall, equality advocate, author, educator, former diversity, equity, and belonging practitioner, but those things still mean a great deal to me, especially the equality part. A visual description: I'm a dark-skinned Black woman with short natural hair, wearing glasses and a black t-shirt. And so glad you have all joined us.
Yeah, thank you so much for your introduction. And the people who are tuning in, Naomi, hi, how great to see you here. And then I hope I pronounced it correctly, Zinzi. Then we have Magdalena tuning in. We also have Teresa, hi, greetings back to the Netherlands. And also Gregor and Nadine. This is awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I was thinking about so many things that I want to share in the beginning that I forgot to share a little bit about myself. So I am working with organizations in Germany, where I was born and raised, but also Europe and in the United States, to become more inclusive. Just in a nutshell, if you want to learn more about me, please feel free to connect with me on my LinkedIn. Okay, so how about we share how we came across this topic and why this is important to us? And Annelie, I'm going to hand it over to you again because I think initially the idea came from your end, and we all agreed like, oh yes, oh we definitely have to talk about that. Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. I think, yeah, this has been a conversation which we have had amongst ourselves, and what really made me think more in detail about this was the idea of the potential to do harm with the work we do, and the idea of impact versus intent and how that works in practice. So I know I've come to you both before with sometimes stories of frustration and venting when I feel I see in my circles that there are some practitioners who might be doing harm. So it seemed like the perfect place to have this discussion and to hear from different perspectives around the world, because I know DEIB is very different all over the world, and it depends a lot on geographic location. So I'm speaking primarily from my experience based here in the Netherlands in Northwest Europe.
Thank you. Anything you want to add to that, Sharon?
Yes, I'm going to just add that it was a very wide-ranging conversation, and it turned out that when we had it, that many of us had this experience or observed this situation of unhealed DEIB practitioners, shall we say, doing work, but also doing harm as they did it. And it seemed that it was a very important conversation to bring to the fore. And, you know, it's something that we all care so deeply about, and it is important that the work is done in a way. It's important that the work is done, but it is also important that it's done in a way where we're not causing harm to others. And before I hand back over to Ellen, just want to shout out Audrey, Naomi, Mark. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you. Yeah, Mark is a fan. Mark says Sharon Hurley Hall, the real deal, and Sharon Hurley is a truth teller, and I can just agree. So our goal for today would be that we not only explain what diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging work is all about, but also what might be going wrong, and hopefully to also have some solutions, because we love to rant in our safer spaces. But I think it's also crucial to not become part of the problem and to contribute to some solutions. And I know we can all do that. So let's start with some definitions to bring everybody up to speed. Diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Anyone who would like to start, just start and let us know.
I love how the first question, we're all waiting for the other person, Sharon. Maybe I'll go ahead with maybe not so much what the definition is, but what DEIB means to me in my work. For me, it's more a set of skills. So myself as a practitioner, it is something that we're all constantly working on. And I'm very very keen to note the difference between the words. Diversity is a very different thing from inclusion. Equity is very different from belonging. But I would say as a whole, I see them as acronyms for personal development and self-awareness, sometimes on a group level, societal level, sometimes on an individual level. But for me, it's really, it's a way that we can include voices that previously were maybe not being included or silenced, whether that is on a big scale or a small scale. And I see my role here as facilitating a space for these discussions to happen, whatever the topic. But I will hand it over to Sharon, who's a wordsmith for.
I actually love the fact that you didn't dive down into the alphabet soup of the acronym, because so often we get caught up in what this or that word means to an individual or a particular organization without thinking about the overarching concept of what we're working towards, more equality for everyone, redressing imbalances, all of those sorts of things, which I think are more important than the terminology itself. And so for me, this idea that we can work towards equality, that we can redress imbalances, that we can make sure that people get their needs met, without it being some sort of huge ask of them, so without people having to do huge amounts of work in order to get these needs met, right? That we get these met as of right, that we're working towards that kind of world. That's more important to me than whether we use a particular, whether diversity means this to this or that person, or inclusion or belonging. Yeah. So that's kind of where I stand. And thank you for taking the lead on that, Annelie, which really helped me to clarify where I was going.
Yes, and I like that so much. The first thing I had in mind was belonging, which I think is the most important letter of all of those. And that for me means that all our needs are met. And I think this is what is going wrong oftentimes in organizations, or what is overseen or not seen. And in order to be able to see that, or to know about that, or to hear that, is to be aware, and to acknowledge and to work towards making this possible, to know what the needs are and to meet the needs.
Can I jump in again just to say that Erica in the chat has made a really good point about accessibility. And again, I think when you... About accessibility, yes, accessibility is another important part of the work that I've been doing a lot of recent learning on. For a long time, I thought it was part of each of the D, E, and I, but it really does need a separate and intentional focus layered on. And, for me, in the work that I've been doing in the last couple of years, if you have a focus on equality, it tends to bring all of those multiple layers into the I don't know what, into the pot, things to be considered. Because definitely, how can you be really doing DEIB work if you're not considering accessibility needs, if you're not considering having those needs met, if you're not making sure that people don't have to jump through hoops in order to have that done, So yes, very, 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 very important. So thank you so much, Erica, for bringing that in the comments.
Yes. Annelie, anything you want to add?
I think just maybe another layer. I completely agree with what Erica also said in the comments. But another way that I look at it is a rebalancing of power dynamics. And sometimes it is power dynamics on an individual level within a team, or sometimes we're looking more structural and globally. And I think there's often a lot of pushback or a negative reaction to the idea of DEIB in some circles, because it is seen as taking away power from other people. But the way I like to think about it more is a redistribution of power. And that is sensitive on all levels. And I think that is also why it is so important in our work that we ensure we aren't doing no harm, or at least we aspire to that. Because I think ensuring that we do is yeah, we all slip up, myself included, and it is not a done and dusted, I have now learned everything. I think for all of us, it is very much a lifelong learning. So
Absolutely, absolutely, Annelie. And I think that brings us to one of the key points, which is that even within the practice of DEIB, you can have resistance to that redistribution. You can have people who have certain identities feeling that they know more, can do better, have done all the work they need to do. And so then they show up in a way that is not helpful and can actually be harmful to certain groups. And I mean, that applies no matter what identity. I mean, I have seen it happen, as I'm sure you have, in lots of different spaces to lots of different people. And I think as practitioners in the space, as advocates, as people who aspire to live lives that promote equality, that redress imbalances, then it is something that we have to think about in our own work, and also in terms of how we go into those spaces and address those structural issues.
So obviously, thank you. Yeah, obviously people are getting something wrong, maybe, or maybe it is not so clear because the whole topics are super complex. So I don't want to shame anyone here, but Gregor said something earlier. It seems that the issue of DEIB practitioners doing harm to the cause is obviously important. Even more significant than that, however, has been Microsoft seeming to walk away from their DEI commitments. And also in the US, I think it is 1 year ago, there was a lawyer who sued or sent out, I don't know how you call that, letters to, I think, 100 big corporates in the US saying you need to pull back with your DEIB commitments. And so there have been whole teams fired, or just people in these certain roles being, released from their work. And what is it that the people might have struggled to understand? But if it's about balancing power, and you said it before, Annelie, people are scared that their power that the power is taken away from them. Would you like to speak about that?
Yeah, maybe if I can just jump onto the comment that Naomi left. She said it's ultimately about humanity, humility, empathy, and compassion. And I think that really summarizes for me the idea that it's about all those things and dignity. And for me, dignity, it's a very hard word to measure, as are humanity, humility, empathy, and compassion. And it is often a feeling that we are trying to help people feel like they belong, like they are part of the group. And for me, the power imbalances are sometimes things that we have gone so long without being addressed because they are the status quo. And it is difficult. Change is hard, for all of us. And even on an individual level, it can be very unsettling for the way, you have seen the world, your perspective on the world, to be shaken. And to be said, is this, to what extent might you be complicit in some of these bigger systems? And that takes a lot of work and a lot of self-awareness as well. So I think self-awareness is one thing I would add as well to that great list that Naomi started. But the idea of redistribution of power, I think, it's one that scares people. Just the thought of it scares people because you're going to change something. And I think what I aim to do as a practitioner is maybe just shine a light on, do we see the power dynamics at play here? Before we need to dismantle the system or change anything, the first step is really observing it and seeing that just because this has been the status quo, for example, it's normal to have a board of exclusively white men. I think that questioning from people who are maybe not part of the majority culture in that way is a really important thing to do. And yeah, I see a lot of people jumping in the comments. They are attacking and blaming DEI for everything. Yeah, I think this is also, it's a word that is easy, or an acronym that's easily weaponized. And in the wrong hands, I think I was actually Googling just before we had this call, do no harm. And one of the first websites that comes up, or at least in my searches, is very much anti-woke. And the idea, I was quite surprised. So I went down that rabbit hole. Sharon, what about you?
Well, no, I really appreciated Naomi's comment. For those who don't know, Naomi is a deep thinker on these issues and definitely someone worth paying attention to. She did a phenomenal essay in my newsletter recently called There Is Only Us. Recommend that everybody read it. And it's about taking a different approach to identity issues, more nuanced. But before I go down that rabbit hole, let me come back to the main point, because I was in danger of going off at a tangent there. I think people who have been used to holding power and who have taken it for granted, who have never thought to question it, don't like having their worldview shaken up, as you've said. They think that they're going to be losing out, and they don't think about what there is to gain from having these wider range of perspectives and inputs and making their life richer and reconnecting with their own humanity. Because a lot of the systems that we have now, the systems that practices like DEI and approaches like DEI are meant to redress, disconnect us from our history, our ancestry, our humanity, disconnect us from each other, and make us think that certain things are important when really they're not on a human scale, right? So, all this, this drive to be productive, this drive to make lots of money, this drive for power and control, is that really the way that we need to live? If you look at some of the practices from our ancestors, that's not necessarily the way they lived. And, that we can reconnect with that, albeit maybe in a different way in 2024. And so I think part of the conversation has to be, there are things that you gain from this, even if you don't see them immediately, right? But then the other issue is, what about the people? I mean, I may set the cat among the pigeons, but some parts of DEI appear to have been colonized. Okay, right? And that might be a harsh word, but that is to say that there are unhealed people out there, who jumped on the bandwagon, and some of them who jumped off again now, but who jumped on the bandwagon, seeing this as a way to, I don't know, possibly just make some money. I'm not saying that their hearts weren't in the right place totally, but maybe some people had not done all the work they needed to do, the self-work, the self-reflection, the self-awareness that we all have to have. I mean, we all have to have, I think, for me, intellectual humility, open curiosity about other people in order to do the learning that we need to do, the self-learning, the self-growth that we need to do in order to do this work. And I feel that sometimes in some situations I've come across, and I don't know about you, Annelie, and you, Ellen, you come across people where they've got to a certain point but no further. And there are things where they need to lift up a rock and look underneath it, and they have not looked underneath that rock, right?
So Kate Price writes, hello to everyone, not harsh at all, Sharon, accurate, and I do agree. But could you talk a little bit more about what it means if people are unhealed, or how come that we might all be unhealed, and what kind of consequence does that concretely have if we are DEIB practitioners?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here when we're talking, if I speak from personal experience. Until about 10, 15 years ago, I really struggled with the idea that I was not white. I was born in Sweden. I was raised amongst a lot of white people. And in my head, there was this very much entrenched idea that I was inferior because I was not white. And, that is not any reflection on my upbringing or my parents. It was just the time. And I went to a lot of international schools, and I was in a bubble where I myself just thought it was better. And I think I would it has taken me a lot of work on myself, a lot of therapy, which is also a privilege to be able to get therapy and to work through some of these issues. But I can see how now I've started looking at things like white privilege, but for myself. I carry a lot of white privilege. I have a white passing name. I have a Swedish passport. And those have been things that I've had to unpack for myself. And this idea of guilt as well. So I've been through a process, and I would say it's ongoing. It's always ongoing. But for me, the real turning point was when I saw that actually, no, this idea that you need to strive towards whiteness is problematic on so many levels and deeply colonial. And as a product of colonism, I've descended from the Dutch and the British and part Portuguese, so as colonial as it comes. So I've had to face a lot of my history and my past. And for me, that's been a sometimes unpleasant, looking at experiences of white privilege and realizing I have unearned privilege. I didn't earn any of this. I'm here, I'm working as a freelance DEI trainer because of my passport privilege. So those have all been issues on a personal level that I've kind of been working through. And I see someone has put in the comments, internalized racism, internalized monster, racial battle fatigue. Yeah, there's lots of terms, and I think everybody's journey looks slightly different. But thank you for sharing those terms, Alta Gracia. Sharon, what about you?
I so relate to this, Annelie, because I think it's almost impossible to come out of a colonial, past. I grew up in former British colonies, right, without internalizing a little bit of that. Especially it was rife in older generations. I remember people saying, "Oh, if she's the darker sister, she can't be the pretty one." They would talk about your hair, the texture of it and all that kind of thing. And so, and you had there were all these ideas about how you were supposed to show up as a Black person, what you were supposed to have humility over, and what you were supposed to celebrate in yourself, right? And what you were supposed to celebrate did not look like me. That's all I'm going to say. Did not look like me in any way, shape, or form. Not the skin color, not the hair, not the lack of makeup, not the lack of jewelry, none of those things, right? And so that in itself it requires a lot of unpacking. And for me, I think that process started for me young, in the sense that I lived in France for a year, experienced a lot of racism. And at the end of the year, I had to make a decision about how I was moving forward myself, how I wanted to treat other people. And so that was that was one part of the journey for me. The longer part of the journey has been the self-love. The longest part of the journey, which is ongoing, is continually finding those things in myself that come out of that early conditioning, right? They're there. You don't want to accept that they're there. You don't want to admit they're there. But if you take a minute to examine them, you know that they're there. And, that is the work that we have to do. I don't go into spaces where I'm doing DEI work saying I've done it all, I know it all, I am healed. I'm saying I'm unhealed too. I have things to learn too. We are all in this together. We all have things to learn. Let us make this world better together. And so that is my approach. You have to work on yourself. You have to work on yourself. And if you're not doing that work in some way, shape, or form, then you can end up causing harm to someone, maybe in the language you use, maybe in the internalized white supremacy that you bring into a space where you're supposed to be doing the work, maybe in the internalized racism that you bring into a space where you're supposed to be doing in the work, attitudes about different communities, things that you have learned, conflicting things that you have learned. Okay, to give one example, growing up in the Caribbean in the 70s, there was one set of people saying, "Oh, Black power, Black is beautiful, Black is," and there was another set of people saying, "Oh my gosh, I don't want to be African. I don't want to be African." It had, those internalized ideas about what that meant, right? Coming out of that history of enslavement. enlightenment. So, we all have to examine those things, take a long, hard look at those things and ourselves, and do our work so that we can show up and we can say to people, yeah, these are things that we all have to learn. And I'm hogging the mic, but I'm just going to say one more thing. And we're talking about the colonial background, but that also applies in places where our populations are minoritized, because in both cases, in both situations, what you have in the media, in the presentation, in the history, this idea of the supremacists, this supremacy of whiteness, the ideal of whiteness, and that applies in so many places across the world, right? No matter what the identity of the people, the majority of the people who live in it. So yeah, just throwing that out into the room.
Yeah. And I think maybe to add on, Sharon, what you said about whiteness, that brings up the whole colorism debate as well, and the whole discussion. I know from a South Asian perspective, the lighter skinned you were, the more privileges you often have. And that is, of course, the intersection of class as well, and in India, caste. But there is so much complexity layered on these multiple identities that we all carry. And I think the responsibility we then have as practitioners is we are trying to help people or guide people through some of this work. And I think being aware of our own healing and our own journey is crucial. I would never go into a room claiming to be a DEIB expert, not at all. There are areas that I speak from lived experience, and there are a lot of areas where I don't. And I think the idea of humility, like you said, from ourselves as practitioners is really important to remember, because otherwise we are in danger of sometimes virtue signaling. I saw that was in the comments somewhere, but yeah, to a whole different direction.
Absolutely. And, I see a comment from Naomi there about the hair being called a Brillo pad. I think mine was steel wool, same sort of thing. It's like, I think we really have that responsibility to have the humility to know the areas in which we are still learning, and to signal that to the people that we are helping to guide.
How can we do that? I mean,
we can just
really practice.
We can do.
It might be that people not know how to do that, because we don't do a lot of self-reflection. We don't normally learn at school how to be vulnerable in conversations.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. I was doing, my previous company, I was doing something. The group that I was facilitating on a regular basis said they wanted to learn something about the Black trans experience. I said, so when I went away, I couldn't find anyone to come and speak. I went away, I did my research, and I started the session by saying, this is research. I have no lived experience in this area. I recommend that you take this as a starting point to go and find out from people with the lived experience what this is like, and to hear more about what they say is the right approach in these different situations. There is nothing wrong with going in and saying, see, this idea that we have to be the experts in everything is another white supremacist notion that we have to unlearn, right? It is okay. And, this is anybody that's ever been in spaces with me knows that, I am very comfortable saying what I know and what I don't know, right? Mm-hmm. I think that is the only way to fly, honestly. And I think that if we can get ourselves out of that conditioning that says we have to go into the room as the expert in everything, then, that humility in itself can be a valuable teaching and facilitation tool for the people that we are talking to about these things. That is how we start to avoid doing harm, right? And also we don't encourage people to take things as gospel when we're still learning and then themselves go out and do harm.
Yeah, and maybe another practical thing to add to that, what you asked, Ellen, is, how do we encourage other people to be vulnerable? How do we encourage other people to share? I think that starts with us. And, it starts with obviously saying we're not the experts on X, Y, or Z. but also in what I try and do is share why I'm in that space, and are there many other people who look like me in that space? Often there are not. And why am I in this space? Often it is because of passport privilege. It is because of I am Western enough. I know the corporate world enough to be in those spaces. So I'm also very careful to not represent communities which I feel would be unethical to say. I would never say I am representing all Sri Lankans, let alone all people of color, because that is ridiculous. But I think the acknowledgement of how we have got to the place that we are, and also what privileges it was that brought us there, whilst also not undermining, of course, it was also hard work, and we didn't fall into these roles. We have all done the work ourselves to get there. But to me, sharing with people that I'm as biased and as sometimes racist in my head, and because I'm human, and it is no easier for me than it is for other people. And I think that acknowledgement really, for me, is the way that we can start to have these discussions without shaming and naming and, trying to. I don't think shame is the way to get people to change. It is not. Yeah.
And I think also modeling, reflecting before acting is a good thing to show people. And I also want to pick up on something that Naomi just dropped in the chat. Open, honest conversations like these, not assuming we know who is in the room. That is one thing that aggravates me big time, the notion that we know who is who based on our assumptions. Because we still can't we can't assume that people share our identity, for example, based on external factors, right? Now I can walk down the street in London and somebody's going to start talking to me in Yoruba, right? Because they have assumed, looking at me, that I share a particular identity, which I don't share, right? So, again, that curiosity, that asking, that establishing, and all of this, I think, is stuff that we can model as practitioners in the space, right? We can model that curiosity. We can model not assuming. We can model what it's like to show up unhealed, but aware of the need for healing and still do the work. We can model not assuming our expertise in every area. And so when we take that out into the room, it makes it easier for the people that we are facilitating, training, teaching, to then go into their spaces and show up in a similar way. I think.
The question that I'm asking myself is, now we're sitting here, we're cheering for the people in the chat. These are the people in our community. They are also doing the work. But oftentimes when we facilitate these conversations in organizations with, let's say, white people, we don't have the same resonance, right? So I'm wondering, how can we do that? And recently I facilitated a meeting internally with the people in my organization, because I was talking about white supremacy culture. And so if you don't know that, now is your time to Google. So it's, for instance, perfection, right? Sharon, you said recently that we all thrive to be an expert. And, there are a couple of things that describe this mindset and this way of thinking. And since I know this and I'm aware of this, and I feel, oh, this is not doing me any good, I try to deconstruct that. I try to relearn that, but only because I also have access to this, and because I understand and have the intrinsic motivation to change that. Because I know I will do harm to myself and I will do harm to others. I mean, in the first place, we're doing harm to ourselves oftentimes. This is violence, and we don't even realize, right? So the question that I would have is, can we convince people? We said shaming doesn't work, but we cannot force people to do that. And I think modeling is a great thing, but if if people are not listening to what I have to share, I think it's difficult. Any ideas how we can tackle that?
I think we adjust our tactics to be fit for the room that we are in. And every now and then you'll come across certain questions that really lead to a rich discussion. One of the ones that I used in a group of people of varying identities, right? First of all, I established what they consider to be their identity. And then I asked a question as to when they first became aware that they had that identity. And that led to a very rich discussion about identity, about the things that were taken for granted, about the things that were not taken for granted, about the assumptions that we had about different groups. So I think this is where our experience in the field and also our knowledge of the way that we have undertaken our own learning can come into play as we encourage people to reflect. And you can encourage people to reflect without causing shame. You can just ask them to think about a thing. And as you progress in this work, you will find things that require that engender more reflection than others. And then those are the things that you work with more often. So yeah, let me hand it over to Annelie, who's working more consistently in this way. So I'm sure you have lots to add there.
Well, I think, yeah, we could talk about this for days, but what it made me really think of is the idea that often we are trying to depolarize dialogue. A lot of the facilitation work, what we do, or at least what I find myself doing, is sometimes you're preaching to the choir, and, there are a lot of people on board who really understand the need to feel like you belong in a space and how important that is and the effect that can have on your mental and physical health. But then we also have the other side of the room, let's say, who you can feel the resistance and you can feel, sometimes sometimes it's quite open and vocal in some sessions. And for me, what I like to start to do is see, where is my resistance in myself? What is it about XYZ participant in my training that I feel is annoying me more than maybe it should? Is it the repeated behavior? Is this a pattern that I've seen? Or do I feel like it's a personal attack? And I think differentiating for me between, okay, the aim for, say, for example, a session is to provide people with vocabulary to talk about cultural differences. That is something that I do regularly. And that's a good starting point, So instead of calling someone rude and this and that, you're able to use maybe different language. But the added layer on top of that is, what is the norm that we are striving for? So in these cultures, what is the culture we are all trying to adapt to and, fit into? And I think it's those additional reflective questions that you need to have, or that I try and work with to show people, yes, there are lots of models out there on culture. All of them are wrong. Some of them are useful. And I think that it is a case of being careful not to just pick and choose what fits our own narrative. And I think it is very easy in some of the work, and I speak as an interculturalist here, to pick some of the theories and the ways of communicating them that work well for us. But a question I ask myself a lot and that I've been looking into is, we talk about culture, and as interculturalists, we like to think of ourselves as, people who are not so ethnocentric. We do think from different perspectives, but then we are all using the same models, the same Western Eurocentric literature. And some of us are questioning it in the field and saying, oh, we should look into more. But then you get into the whole discussion of, what is a model? Are we looking at models in the traditional way that it can be nicely displayed and you can teach it? Or are there other models, like, for example, there are a lot of models around culture from the Maoris in New Zealand, who it might not look like an academic model in peer-reviewed journals, which is what we are used to using. And with me, I include myself in there as someone who primarily had Western higher education. It's a case of saying, look, I need to look at myself as well. Why am I, teaching what I'm teaching? What are the sources that I'm selecting? And I've completely forgot the initial question, Ellen, but here we are now.
But I want to pick up on what Annelie is saying there from two perspectives. One, you said something very profound about communicating in the way you've always communicated, but then what good is communication if the message is not reaching the people it needs to reach? So for me, as a former journalist and media person, it's a lot of it is about how can we communicate in a way that reaches people. So that's one of the reasons I tell stories in my newsletter, because people love stories, right? People love to hear about their shared experiences, and often, if you can, you bring them along with you, then you can say, okay, and here's the point of reflection at the end, right? So there are lots of techniques, but also from the point of view of considering the sources of the information that we are using for our work, right? I've just come out of 2 companies where we were very intentional about seeking sources that were not. We actually used to have a whole grid in one of them where we would say, okay, we're talking about this topic. What is this? Who is the main speaker in this resource? Is there a global majority person? Is there a person from a different cultural background? Is there a person from a different country that is also speaking about this that we're not finding? Can we dig a little deeper in order to find those sources? Because I had the same westernized education as many people, right? But just in asking those questions, actually what it raises for me, and think for me certainly, is that even the internet is kind of colonized, right? It's like it is so much harder often to find these sources of information. I don't want to call them alternative, but these additional sources of information from places that are not peer-reviewed Western research journals. You really have to put in the effort. But in a way, putting in the effort and talking about the fact that you have to put in that effort is another way of saying, okay, here's something else that we need to look at, right? And again, I suspect that we've got slightly off topic, but I thought that was an interesting point to bring to the fore. How we communicate, what the sources are, and the effort that it takes. And even in that effort, we learn something.
Yes, and you talk about communication, and oftentimes we might think about the way we communicate, like what are we saying, how are we saying this? And I've been dancing around my words and the feedback of some participants on what did I say wrong and why did I instead of getting more into a conversation with the people, or to just lean back, what I'm just doing here, listening to you, monitoring the chat. And I feel really overwhelmed because it's so much information and so many bits. And like Annelie said, we can talk about this for hours, but I think an important skill is to be able to listen. A lot of people who are working somewhere on stage, facilitating, keynote speaking, training facilitation, or giving trainings, they're used to be on stage and to talk. And I like to listen to myself, but sometimes I'm also really fed up. So I think it's really important to listen to the people, especially to those who are opposing the DEIB or who are opposing the models that we're talking about. And I really like nonviolent communication to come from a place, and let's close this now, coming back to belonging, where the needs are met. So oftentimes people look at me saying like, what, you would talk to a Nazi in Germany? And I say, yes. I mean, preaching to the choir will not change anything, but I really want to understand people. Sometimes I know there are boundaries and I cannot go further, and I don't want to do harm to myself, but I really want to understand the needs and the resistance or the defense that people are showing is just protecting their needs. It makes sense for them in this moment to be hesitant or resistant or being offensive. And I don't want to excuse that. And I don't want to say I'm accepting anyone who's doing harm to me. But I think it's important that we listen to the people and understand from where they're coming from. And in order to do that, I think, yeah, that takes a lot of practice, to listen to people, to listen to voices. And then you might get to the point where you are finding people on LinkedIn, on social media, or wherever, who are not like you, and that you don't judge just because they look in a certain way, and you would assume they're very privileged or they are this or that. I'm also privileged. So Ellen, just pause for a moment and listen to what the person has to say. And maybe this one thing that a person says is not everything that represents this person, right? We've been talking about intent and impact. And I used to be a huge advocate for it's only about the impact. So if you're saying, Ellen, you're so articulate, and I'm a Black woman, and I'm saying, oh, this is a microaggression, I don't like that. You said something racist, end of discussion, because the impact is really bad. Nowadays, I pause for a second and I ask more questions to clarify. So I ask, trying to be calm, what do you mean by that? And then maybe the person says, oh, I've seen you on stage, the way you're presenting, it's amazing. I could never do that. So I think you're really awesome. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, it got nothing to do with racism. So I think taking pauses, listen to people, ask more questions to understand and not to ask questions to
listen to understand,
to give
and
answers.
not to react.
Exactly. So we should listen to understand and not listen to give an answer, because that is also how I got socialized in Germany, and what is also part of the US culture. In any kind of meeting, people are waiting. When is my turn? Okay, now I have to contribute. And I think that takes a lot of relearning and unlearning. And I'm trying to look at the time, and I'm getting a little upset, but we're coming to an hour, and I think we have to do another conversation. But shall we try to close this conversation, and everybody can just add a couple of more things that are coming to your mind right now, if that is okay? Yeah.
Okay. I so appreciate the space to have this conversation and conversations like these, because I think they're very important. And even though we may be in many cases preaching to the choir, to the people that already know us, this is also a resource that is out there that can be taken out to be shared with other people that may not know us. And so they can hear how we think about these things, how we want to approach them, some of the considerations. And so I think, I would end with doing no harm means doing our work, means listening. It means being curious. It means being open. It means not making assumptions. Being aware that there's stuff out there that we don't know yet, but being willing to learn it. So thank you. And thanks for all the wonderful comments. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but this has been a great conversation. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Sharon. And from my side also, I've been really not distracted, but intrigued by all the comments that are coming in. And I know we have other practitioners as well on the call. So I will definitely be going back and reading what people have had to say. But for me, I really appreciate the spaces like this where we can reflect on our own practices and acknowledge that we all still have work to do, and anything that does trigger me or, makes me stop and think. Yes, it's often uncomfortable. But for me, that's where we learn. And I think doing so in community is so important. I know the two of you, we met virtually through an online community, and I think we all know if we were in the same space, we would talk for years and years before the before Zoom cut us off. So I also appreciate the community that one can build online. You know, if you don't feel like you belong, maybe in your immediate circle or in your team, there are bigger spaces which we now have access to. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Whew. What else can I add here? I think one word that came to my mind is I'd like to be more humble, compassionate with myself. I think this is something that I learned. We don't know everything, and that is okay. We're here to learn. This is a room for growth, for learning. I also like to add that we don't always have to step out of our comfort zone. Everybody is different. We have different needs. But if you have the energy, I would like to invite you to do that as often as you can, so that we can advance the equity for everybody. So thank you, Annelie. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much for everybody who joined this conversation. The comment section was on fire. I think I need some time to go through that and to really let this conversation sink in. And so many things that I want to continue my learning and my thinking. And thank you so much, Ilias, in the background for helping us moderate this session. And thank you to my team. Thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you again in the next conversation rooms that are coming up. Let me think, in September. We're going to continue. There's a little summer break now in August. And if you like that conversation, please refer us, recommend us, share with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family. We highly appreciate that. So thank you so much for everyone, and have a good day, have a good night, and take care.